At 9:30 that evening, Dr. Watson found himself sitting beside Sherlock Holmes in a horse-drawn cab, a revolver in his pocket, and the old excitement of adventure returning after 3 years. Holmes was alive. Ronald Adair had been murdered inside an apparently impossible locked room, and somewhere in London, one of Professor Moriarty's most dangerous associates was still free. Holmes had revealed almost nothing about what he planned to do that night. He only made one thing clear. The danger that had kept him hidden for 3 years had followed him back to London. And before the night was over, Holmes intended to face it. But this time, Holmes was not simply hunting his enemy. He was preparing to make himself the target. Before we continue, subscribe to Midnight Archives and leave your theory in the comments. Who killed Ronald Adair? How was he shot inside that locked room? And what does his murder have to do with Sherlock Holmes? Keep those questions in mind, because every answer is waiting inside The Adventure of the Empty House, Part 2. It felt exactly like the old days. I sat beside Holmes in the cab with my revolver in my pocket and that familiar sense of anticipation in my heart. Holmes, however, remained cold, serious, and silent. As the streetlights passed his face, I could see that he was deep in thought. His eyebrows were drawn together and his lips were tightly pressed. I had no idea what kind of criminal we were about to hunt through the dark streets of London, but Holmes' expression told me that our mission was extremely serious. Every now and then a grim smile appeared on his face. Whatever Holmes had planned, I suspected that the person we were hunting would not enjoy the outcome. I assumed we were heading toward Baker Street, but Holmes stopped the cab at the corner of Cavendish Square. The moment he stepped onto the street, he carefully looked in both directions. At every corner after that, he took the same precaution, making certain that no one was following us. Our route through London was strange and complicated. Holmes knew the hidden streets of the city better than anyone I had ever known. He led me quickly through a maze of narrow passages, back streets, carriage houses, and stable yards whose existence I had never even suspected. Eventually, we reached a small street lined with old, gloomy houses. From there, we passed into Manchester Street and then Blandford Street. Suddenly, Holmes turned into a narrow passage, went through a wooden gate, and entered a deserted yard. At the rear of one of the houses, he took out a key and opened the back door. We stepped inside. Holmes closed the door behind us. The house was completely dark. From the sound beneath my feet, I could tell that the floors were bare. The old wooden boards creaked as we moved, and when I reached out into the darkness, my hand touched a wall where strips of wallpaper hung loose. Holmes took hold of my wrist and silently guided me down a long hallway. Eventually, I could make out the faint outline of the glass above the front door. Then Holmes suddenly turned to the right. We entered a large square room. It was completely empty. Dark shadows filled the corners, while a small amount of light from the street outside came through a window covered in dust. There was no lamp in the room, and I could barely see Holmes standing beside me. He placed one hand on my shoulder and leaned close enough to whisper into my ear. "Do you know where we are?" I looked carefully through the dirty window. Across the street, I saw a place I knew very well. "That's Baker Street." "Exactly," Holmes whispered. We were inside Camden House, an empty building directly across from our old rooms at 221B Baker Street. I still did not understand why Holmes had brought me there. He asked me to move closer to the window, but warned me not to let anyone outside see me. Then he told me to look toward our old rooms. I carefully approached the window and looked across the street. What I saw made me gasp. The shade in Holmes' old room was pulled down, and a strong light burned behind it. Against that bright background was the dark shadow of a man sitting in a chair. The shape of the head was unmistakable. So were the shoulders and the sharp profile. It looked exactly like Sherlock Holmes. For a moment, I instinctively reached toward the man standing beside me, just to make sure he was really there. Holmes began shaking with silent laughter. He clearly enjoyed my confusion. I told him the illusion was remarkable. From where we stood, I would have sworn that Sherlock Holmes himself was sitting inside the room across the street. Holmes explained that a French artist named Oscar Munier had created the wax bust for him in Grenoble. Holmes had arranged everything else during his visit to Baker Street earlier that afternoon. I asked why he would go to so much trouble. Holmes' answer was simple. He wanted certain people to believe he was inside Baker Street when he was actually somewhere else. I immediately understood. Someone was watching his rooms. Holmes corrected me. He did not merely suspect that the rooms were being watched. He knew it. The people watching belonged to the remains of Moriarty's criminal organization. They were among the few people who knew Sherlock Holmes survived the Reichenbach Falls. Holmes knew sooner or later they expected him to return to Baker Street, and that morning they had seen him arrive. I asked how he could be certain. Holmes told me that he had recognized the man watching from outside. His name was Parker, a criminal known for strangling his victims, and strangely enough, for being very skilled at playing the Jew's harp. Parker himself did not concern Holmes very much. The man behind Parker did. Holmes described him as Moriarty's closest surviving associate, the same man who had thrown rocks at Holmes from above the Reichenbach Falls 3 years earlier. He was one of the most intelligent and dangerous criminals in London, and that night Holmes knew the man was hunting him. But there was one thing the criminal did not know. Holmes was hunting him, too. Slowly, the purpose of the empty house became clear. The illuminated figure across the street was bait. Holmes and I were hidden in darkness, watching the people who believed they were watching him. For a long time we waited. People moved up and down Baker Street, most of them wrapped tightly in coats against the cold wind. Holmes barely moved. His attention remained fixed on the street. Once or twice I thought I recognized the same people passing more than once. 2 men in particular seemed to be sheltering from the wind in a doorway farther up the street. I quietly tried to point them out to Holmes. He responded with an impatient sound and continued watching. As the hours passed, however, I noticed a change in him. Holmes began moving his feet restlessly. His fingers tapped rapidly against the wall. Something was bothering him. His plan was not developing exactly as he had expected. Midnight approached. The street gradually became empty. Holmes began pacing through the dark room with increasing frustration. Then I looked again toward Baker Street. Something had changed. I grabbed Holmes by the arm. "The shadow has moved." The figure in the window was no longer showing its profile. Its back was now turned towards us. Holmes seemed almost offended that I found this surprising. Of course the figure had moved. He had no intention of placing an obvious dummy in the window for hours and expecting some of the smartest criminals in Europe to be fooled by it. We had been waiting in Camden House for 2 hours. During that time, Mrs. Hudson had carefully changed the position of the wax figure every 15 minutes. She approached it from the front so that her own shadow would never appear against the window. Then Holmes suddenly stopped. I heard him draw in a sharp breath. His entire body became rigid. The street outside was now almost completely deserted. The 2 men I had noticed earlier might still have been hiding in the doorway, but I could no longer see them. Everything was silent. Across the street, the bright yellow window remained visible, with the dark figure of Sherlock Holmes sitting at its center. Holmes pulled me quickly into the darkest corner of the room. His hand covered my mouth. His fingers were trembling with excitement. I had rarely seen him so intensely focused. At first, I could hear nothing. Then I noticed it, a faint sound. But it was not coming from Baker Street. It was coming from behind us, from inside the empty house. A door quietly opened and closed. Then came footsteps. Someone was moving down the hallway. The person was trying to walk silently, but every careful step echoed through the empty building. Holmes pressed himself against the wall. I did the same. My hand closed around the grip of my revolver. Through the darkness, I saw the outline of a man appear in the doorway. He stood there for a moment. Then he entered. He moved slowly and carefully, crouching as he came forward. There was something threatening in every movement. He came within a few yards of us. I prepared myself in case he attacked. Then I realized something extraordinary. He had no idea we were there. The man passed directly beside us and moved toward the window. Very carefully, he raised it several inches. The light from the street fell across his face. He was an older man with a thin, prominent nose, a high, bald forehead, and a large gray mustache. His face was lean and dark, marked by deep, harsh lines. His eyes were shining with excitement. He carried what at first appeared to be a walking stick. When he placed it on the floor, however, it made a metallic sound. Then he removed a bulky object from beneath his coat. There was a sharp click. He worked with the object for several moments, using considerable strength to operate some kind of mechanism. A long, grinding sound filled the room, followed by another powerful click. Only then did I understand what I was seeing. It was a gun. But it was unlike any gun I had seen before. The stock had an unusual shape, and the weapon seemed to operate through some kind of compressed mechanism. The man opened the breech, inserted something, and closed it again. Then he lowered himself beside the open window. He rested the barrel on the window ledge. His eye moved along the sights. Across Baker Street, the illuminated silhouette of Sherlock Holmes sat perfectly still. The man adjusted the weapon against his shoulder. For one brief moment, everything became completely silent. Then his finger tightened around the trigger. There was a strange, powerful whizzing sound. Across the street came the sharp crash of breaking glass. At that exact moment, Holmes launched himself onto the man's back. He drove him face first onto the floor. The attacker recovered almost instantly and grabbed Holmes by the throat with tremendous strength. I struck the man across the head with the handle of my revolver. He collapsed again. I threw myself on top of him and held him down, while Holmes blew a sharp signal on a whistle.
Almost immediately, we heard people running outside. 2 uniformed police officers and a detective in plain clothes rushed into the house. Holmes recognized the detective at once. It was Inspector Lestrade. Lestrade had personally joined the operation, and despite their long history of professional rivalry, he seemed genuinely pleased to see Sherlock Holmes back in London. Holmes could not resist teasing him. 3 unsolved murders in 1 year, he remarked, were hardly impressive. Still, Holmes admitted that Lestrade had handled the recent Molesey mystery reasonably well. By then, our prisoner was standing between 2 strong police officers. People had begun gathering outside. Holmes closed the window and lowered the shade, while Lestrade produced candles and the officers uncovered their lanterns. For the first time, I could clearly see the man we had captured. His face was powerful but deeply threatening. His forehead suggested intelligence, but the lower half of his face seemed hard and brutal. His blue eyes were cold, his nose aggressive, and every deep line in his face seemed to warn of danger. He ignored the police. His eyes remained fixed on Sherlock Holmes. Hatred and disbelief filled his expression. Again and again, he muttered the same words, "You fiend, you clever, clever fiend." Holmes calmly straightened his collar. He greeted the man as Colonel and reminded him that they had not seen each other since the Colonel had tried to kill him above the Reichenbach Falls. The prisoner could barely respond. He simply stared at Holmes and repeated that he was a cunning fiend. Then Holmes finally introduced him. This was Colonel Sebastian Moran, formerly of Her Majesty's Indian Army. According to Holmes, Moran had once been the finest big-game hunter in the British Empire and one of the greatest tiger hunters of his time. The colonel said nothing. He simply stared at Holmes with such savage intensity that he reminded me of one of the tigers he had once hunted. Holmes explained the trap. Sometimes experienced hunters tied a young goat beneath a tree and then waited above with a rifle until a tiger came for the bait. That night, Camden House was Holmes' tree. The wax figure across Baker Street was the bait, and Colonel Moran was the tiger. Holmes admitted that Moran had managed to surprise him in one respect. He had expected the colonel to fire from the street. Instead, Moran had chosen the same empty house Holmes was using to observe him. But aside from that, everything went according to plan. Moran suddenly lunged forward in rage, but the police officers pulled him back.
He turned to Lestrade and demanded to be treated according to the law. Whatever reason they had for arresting him, he said, there was no reason he should have to stand there and listen to Sherlock Holmes insult him. Lestrade agreed that the request was reasonable. He asked Holmes whether he had anything else to say before they took the prisoner away. Holmes had picked up Moran's strange weapon and was carefully examining it. He described it as an extraordinary and unique air gun, almost silent but extremely powerful. Holmes knew the man who had built it, a blind German mechanic named von Herder. The weapon had originally been constructed on the orders of Professor Moriarty. Holmes had known about the gun for years, but this was the first time he had actually held it. He told Lestrade to pay particular attention to the weapon and to the bullets designed for it. Lestrade assured him that the police would take care of everything. Then Holmes asked what charge they intended to bring against Colonel Moran. To Lestrade, the answer seemed obvious: attempted murder of Sherlock Holmes. Holmes disagreed. He had no intention of appearing in the case at all. Instead, he told Lestrade that the police could take full credit for capturing the man they had been searching for. Lestrade looked confused. Got him? Got whom, Mr. Holmes? Holmes gave him the answer. Colonel Sebastian Moran was the man who murdered the Honorable Ronald Adair. He had shot Ronald through the open second-floor window of 427 Park Lane on March 30th. And he had done it with the same powerful air gun now lying in Holmes' hands. The impossible locked-room murder suddenly had an answer. Ronald's door had been locked because the killer had never entered the room. No gun had been found because the weapon had never been inside. No one had heard a gunshot because Moran had not used an ordinary firearm, and the open window gave one of the finest marksmen in the world a clear line of fire. Lestrade now had the man, the weapon, and the connection to the murder. Holmes congratulated him with unmistakable irony. Then, after the police left with Colonel Moran, Holmes suggested that we return to Baker Street. Despite the cold air coming through the shattered window, he thought half an hour in his study with a cigar might provide me with a very interesting explanation. When I entered our old rooms again, I found them almost exactly as I remembered them. Mycroft Holmes and Mrs. Hudson had preserved everything during Holmes's absence. The room was perhaps a little cleaner than before, but all the familiar objects remained. The chemical equipment was still in its corner. The old table was still marked by acid stains. Holmes's collection of reference books and scrapbooks still filled the shelves. His violin case was there. So was his pipe rack. Even the Persian slipper he used to hold his tobacco remained in its old place. Mrs. Hudson was waiting for us. Beside her stood the other occupant of the room, the wax figure of Sherlock Holmes. Up close, the resemblance was extraordinary. The model stood on a small table, dressed in one of Holmes's old robes. From the street, the illusion was nearly perfect. Holmes asked Mrs. Hudson whether she had followed all his instructions. She assured him that she had approached the figure on her knees, exactly as he had told her, so no one watching from outside could see her shadow. Holmes praised her work. Then he asked if she had found where the bullet had gone. Mrs. Hudson explained that, unfortunately, it had damaged his beautiful wax bust. The projectile had passed directly through the head and flattened itself against the wall. She had recovered it from the carpet. Holmes held the bullet out for me to examine. It looked like an ordinary soft revolver bullet, and that, Holmes explained, was the brilliance of Moran's weapon. Who would expect to find a revolver bullet fired from an air gun? After thanking Mrs. Hudson, Holmes invited me to sit once again in my old chair. There were still several things he wanted to explain. He removed the worn coat of his bookseller disguise and changed into the familiar mouse-colored robe that had been draped around the wax figure. For a moment, it felt as though the last 3 years had disappeared. Holmes examined the shattered head of the bust and laughed. Colonel Moran's hands were still steady. His eyesight was still excellent. The bullet had struck almost exactly where Moran intended. Holmes called him one of the finest shots in India and asked whether I had ever heard his name. I had not. Holmes seemed amused. Apparently, fame was unreliable. After all, before our earlier adventures, I had not even heard of Professor James Moriarty, a man Holmes considered one of the greatest criminal minds of the century. Holmes asked me to bring down his biographical index from the shelf. He turned through the pages until he reached the letter M. There were entries for Moriarty and several other criminals Holmes had studied over the years.
Then he found the name we wanted: Moran, Sebastian, Colonel. The record described an impressive career. Moran had been born in London in 1840, the son of Sir Augustus Moran, a former British diplomat in Persia. He had been educated at Eton and Oxford and had served with distinction in several military campaigns. He had even written books about hunting in the Himalayas and his experiences in the jungle. His clubs included the Anglo-Indian, the Tankerville, and the Bagatelle Card Club. But in the margin, Holmes had written one additional sentence: "The second most dangerous man in London." I found it difficult to reconcile that description with Moran's respectable military career. Holmes agreed that the colonel had once done very well. He had nerves of steel. There was even a famous story in India about Moran crawling into a drain after a wounded man-eating tiger. But at some point, something in him changed. Holmes had a theory that people sometimes developed unexpected qualities inherited from generations before them, just as a healthy tree might suddenly grow in a strange direction. I told him the theory sounded rather imaginative. Holmes did not insist that I accept it. Whatever the cause, Sebastian Moran eventually went wrong. There was never one great public scandal, but his reputation in India became so bad that he eventually returned to London. His reputation followed him. Then Professor Moriarty found him. Moran became one of Moriarty's most important associates. Moriarty paid him generously and used him only for crimes that required exceptional skill. Holmes believed Moran had been responsible for other deaths, including that of Mrs. Stewart of Lauder in 1887, though he had never been able to prove it. Even after Moriarty's organization collapsed, Moran remained beyond the reach of the law. Holmes reminded me of the precautions he had taken shortly before our trip to Switzerland, when he had closed the shutters because he feared an attack with an air gun. At the time, I had thought he was being overly cautious. Now I understood. Holmes knew of von Herder's silent weapon, and he knew that one of the best marksmen in the world had access to it. Moran had followed Holmes and Moriarty into Switzerland. He was the man who nearly killed Holmes with falling rocks after Moriarty went over the Reichenbach Falls. While hiding in France, Holmes followed the London newspapers closely, always watching for an opportunity to bring Moran down. As long as Moran remained free, Holmes knew his own life would never be safe. Sooner or later, the colonel would find his chance. But Holmes could not simply kill Moran, and he could not ask the authorities to arrest a man based only on suspicions they could not prove. So, Holmes waited. Then, Ronald Adair was murdered, and Holmes immediately saw his opportunity. Moran had played cards with Ronald. Holmes knew Moran's methods. He understood the significance of the unusual bullet and the silent weapon. Everything pointed in one direction. Holmes became convinced that Sebastian Moran had murdered Ronald Adair. He returned to London, knowing that Moran would learn about it.
Moran knew Sherlock Holmes was one of the few people capable of connecting him to Ronald's death. So Holmes deliberately allowed himself to be seen at Baker Street. He knew the information would reach the colonel, and he knew Moran would become frightened. Holmes expected him to act quickly. The wax figure provided the perfect target. Holmes warned the police that they might be needed, then crossed the street to Camden House and waited. He had expected Moran to attack from somewhere outside. Instead, Moran entered the same empty house. But the result was the same. The tiger had come for the bait. Only one question remained. Why had Colonel Moran murdered Ronald Adair? Holmes admitted that here they were moving beyond proven facts and into theory. Even the most logical mind could be wrong when evidence was incomplete. Still, Holmes believed the explanation was not difficult. Ronald Adair and Colonel Moran had recently won a large amount of money together at cards. Holmes had known for some time that Moran cheated while playing. He believed Ronald had discovered the cheating on the day he was murdered. Ronald probably confronted Moran privately. Rather than immediately creating a public scandal around an older and well-known man, Ronald may have offered him a choice: leave the clubs voluntarily, stop playing cards, or be exposed as a cheat. For Moran, that would have been disastrous. He depended heavily on money he won dishonestly at the card table. Being expelled from his clubs would have ruined him. So Moran decided to silence Ronald. That also explained what Ronald was doing immediately before his death. The names, numbers, and piles of money on his table suggested he was calculating how much money needed to be returned. If Moran had cheated while they were partners, Ronald would not have wanted to keep winnings that were obtained dishonestly. He locked his door because he did not want his mother or sister walking in and asking questions while he worked through the accounts. Then, from outside the house, Colonel Moran took aim through the open window. The silent air gun fired. Ronald Adair died instantly. I told Holmes that I had no doubt he had found the truth. Holmes reminded me that the trial would eventually confirm or disprove his theory. But whatever happened in court, one fact was certain. Colonel Sebastian Moran would no longer threaten us. Von Herder's famous air gun would probably end up in the Scotland Yard Museum. And after 3 years in hiding, Sherlock Holmes was finally free. Free to return to Baker Street. Free to work beside Watson again. And free once more to devote his remarkable mind to the endless mysteries hidden within the complicated life of London. For 3 years, the world had believed Sherlock Holmes was dead. Professor Moriarty was gone. Colonel Sebastian Moran was now in police custody, and the empty chair at 221B Baker Street was empty no longer. Sherlock Holmes had returned, and his adventures were only beginning again. If you solved the mystery before Holmes revealed Colonel Moran, tell us in the comments which clue gave it away. And if you want to return to 221B Baker Street for another original Sherlock Holmes mystery, subscribe to Midnight Archives. The next case is waiting.